Good morning, everyone. In the interest of starting just about on time, I'm going to begin. I'm Christine Saunier. I'm the Nova Scotia Director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. I'm moderating and supporting the tech this morning, doing some multitasking. Before I actually begin the webinar, I do want to recognize that we are all situated on unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory. Governed by the Peace and Friendship Treaties, and we commit and have an obligation to work toward true reconciliation. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, for those who may not know of us, we are an independent, nonpartisan research institute concerned with issues of social and economic justice, as well as environmental sustainability. So I'm the co-author of the Living Wage Report this year with Chelsea Driscoll. I've been working on the living wage in Nova Scotia since 2015. This is my third living wage report. Chelsea Driscoll is the social researcher for the St. John Human Development Council. I'm just gonna go over here and say hi to Chelsea. There she is.
Hi, everyone. There we go. So yeah, my name is Chelsea Driscoll. I am the social researcher for the Human Development Council. We are located in St. John, New Brunswick. And for those who may not know who we are a social planning council that identifies and addresses social issues in the greater St. John area through research, information, coordination, and networking.
Great, thanks. Okay, here's what we have planned for today. I will do an intro on how the living wage is calculated, just a bit of an overview on the method, explain what the budgets are, and provide you with what the living wage rates are for the 4 communities in Nova Scotia. Since this is an update of the living wage that was calculated in 2018 for Halifax and Antigonish, I'll just give you an overview of what's happened since then. Then I will turn it over to Chelsea, who will give you an overview of the St. John living wage and what's happened since 2018. And then we have responses from 3 community representatives. I will have just a few concluding remarks highlighting what the research is telling us and what our recommendations are from this report. And then we will open up for a question and answer period, and we'll be joined by other community representatives who will be there to answer questions. So we have representation from all of the communities for which we have calculated the living wage. I am going to turn off my video and talk to you for a bit using my slide share here. So the calculation of the living wage is actually done following what is called the Canadian Living Wage Framework. That framework is essentially an Excel spreadsheet where the numbers come together to ensure that once we have figured out what the annual living expenses are for our reference household, we make sure that once we have all of the deductions taken off their income, that's employment insurance, that's Canada Pension Plan, that's provincial taxes, and we add in any income that a household might get access to from government. So that's the Canada Child Benefit, that's the GST credit, and any other transfers that a household might get access to. We ensure then that the living wage is one that covers what a family needs at the end of the day, to ensure that they are not only able to meet their basic needs, but that they have a buffer. This is not a poverty wage. This is a wage that is very much about providing a decent quality of life to workers. Our reference household, and I really will not go too far deep into the method. You can read the report. In fact, you can download our Excel spreadsheets and have a look at those. There are detailed guides on how we actually calculate this, but for your information, the reference household is a family of 4, 2 parents working full-time, and full-time in this case is 35 hours a week. Again, this is about quality of life. We want to ensure people actually have some time for themselves. That family with 2 parents working full-time have 2 young children, one age 2 and one age 7. The hourly living wage rate that we calculate does also meet the needs of a single adult and a lone parent with 1 child. The hourly rate may well not be enough for some families, those with more than 2 children, those with younger children where both need more expensive childcare than what is included in our budget. For other households in different life stages, the living wage budget that is allocated to childcare is one that would provide, for example, saving for post-secondary education for different stages of life, may provide for medical concerns that arise later in senior years, or provide a decent retirement income that would supplement the Canada pension plan. The living wage budget that we use to calculate the expenses has 10 different expense categories. The budget pie that you see before you is the one for Halifax, just to give you a sense of how that's allocated. We could do a budget for all of the communities, and the budget pies would actually be very similar. I will talk about that in a bit. But you can see that the largest chunk of the budget in Halifax, and that's true for the other communities, goes to shelter. The second largest is childcare, and the third largest is food, and the fourth is transportation. And those 4 categories as the most expensive are the most expensive across all of our communities. And just so you know what goes into these, again, without going into too much detail, the first category, that is food, is based on the National Nutritious Food Basket. But that budget line does not, for example, consider special dietary needs, cultural or other food preferences, or eating out. The second line is pretty obvious. It's clothing and footwear. The shelter amount is the amount for renting a 3-bedroom accommodation, and includes the cost of basic tenant contents insurance. The assumption is that heat is electric, and that water is included in the rental costs. We do add additional utilities costs there for the electricity, and we also add in the cost of basic internet, including installation fees, as that is something that we consider to be a necessity. The transportation expense does differ somewhat depending on how rural your community is, but the amounts in there include the transportation for maintaining a secondhand car, all of the expenses that go into maintaining a secondhand car, plus a monthly bus pass if a bus pass is available in your community, and a modest budget for a limited number of taxi trips over the year. We consider that transportation budget realistic when you consider a family with 2 parents working, 2 kids in school and childcare, plus one of our parents is taking community college classes. Again, the living wage is one of the principles of the living wage is very much about quality time. Childcare includes full-time care for the 2-year-old, before and after school care for the 7-year-old, as well as any additional fees for that 7-year-old, such as summer and winter break and snow days, etc. There is a line that is called healthcare that is for the cost of basic private health insurance. That's to cover health-related expenses currently not included in Medicare, including dental care and prescription drugs. It's a very basic plan. We do include a budgetary line for contingency or emergency, recognizing that that tiny buffer is certainly a help for people. That is the equivalent of 2 weeks pay per parent per year, so it's still a modest but important emergency budget line. Again, we do have a small amount there for part-time education, recognizing that for many low-wage workers, they would like to access more skills and more education. So we've included in there the Nova Scotia Community College or the New Brunswick Community College fees. That's just for 2 courses and some textbook expenses. The last 2 items, one is the household expenses. So this is everything not covered basically in all the other categories. That's your toiletries, your personal care, toothbrush, deodorant, shampoo, menstrual products. That's small kitchen appliances and tools, household supplies, bank fees, laundry costs, and that includes a cell phone service because we recognize that that also is necessary. The last line is really unique to the living wage work, and that is the social inclusion budget item. This category is really meant to lessen stigma and to allow family members to participate fully in the life of their community, whatever form that participation takes. The category would include expenses such as supplies, school supplies and fees, reading materials, minimal recreation and sports fees, art or music classes, a birthday or holiday gift for a child, for their child, or even for a child to be able to go to somebody else's birthday. Maybe a little budget for entertainment. Perhaps that's a museum fee. Maybe it's one restaurant meal, a family day trip, or toys or games for the kids. Here, and again, I won't leave this up very long. You can have a look at the report. Here are the 4 monthly budgets for the 4 Nova Scotia communities. The amounts that have been allocated for each of these budget items based on data from StatsCan, from the market basket measure, and if needed, surveys done in the communities, and you'll see the totals there. The living wage in Atlantic Canada, the first time we calculated it was actually in 2015, and that first wage was for Halifax. Antigonish was added in 2016, and then St. John, New Brunswick in 2018. Last year, we calculated the living wage rate for St. John's in Newfoundland and Labrador. And this year, we have added 2 more Nova Scotia communities, Bridgewater and Cape Breton Regional Municipality. The calculation of the living wage is important because it does give us real life, real-time costs of living and raising a family in our community. It also allows us to compare across communities, across the country, across provincial boundaries, which you will see makes a difference, as we even are just talking about our neighbor in New Brunswick. Here are the living wage rates that have been calculated for 2020. And an important note on the expenses that I provided to you, those are 2019 expenses. We need a full year in order to get a good grip on the data, but I will talk a little tiny bit about why it's still difficult to capture some of that, the data. But here we go. So the living wage for 2020 for Halifax is $21.80. For Antigonish, it is $19.55, and for the 2 additional communities in Nova Scotia, we have calculated $16.80 for Bridgewater and $17.65 for the Cape Breton Regional Municipality. So according to our calculations, the wage required in Halifax is 23% higher than the lowest Nova Scotia wage in Bridgewater. If we are to look at the monthly budgets, for all 4 communities, the shelter component is, it takes the biggest chunk of the pie at 27% for Halifax, 26% for Antigonish, 24% for Cape Breton, and 21% for Bridgewater. The rental costs that we include here do not reflect what is available on the market or the range of rental prices depending on where you live in a geographic area. That's an important note for the HRM and for the CBRM, where there can be quite a range of rental prices. Even if and the only data I could pull was for the HRM, and just so you have a sense of what this captures, in 2019, in terms of availability, the vacancy rate in HRM was 1%, but that varied from 0.4%, so basically nothing really available in Peninsula South, to 2.1% in Dartmouth North. And then if you look at the costs, we have a high of $1,898 in Peninsula South, to $1,360 a month in Peninsula North, to a low of $897 in what is called Mainland South. That's Armdale, Purcell's Cove, and Spryfield. Similar data is not available for Cape Breton Regional Municipality. But what we know in terms of what the rental data is telling us is that we need more information. This is again for 2019, but even the information that's available doesn't tell us what's for-profit, what's nonprofit, what's public, and what's available. And the data doesn't tell us whether that rent includes utilities or not, which obviously affects the amount that you're paying. The second most expensive item is childcare. The cost for full-time care for the toddler ranged from $761 in Cape Breton to $829 in Halifax. If the family had an infant, that would go up to $939 for Halifax. And the third most expensive, as I said, was food, and the fourth is transportation. And I'm just going to briefly highlight that the wage in Halifax has gone up and Antigonish quite significantly. In Halifax from $19, that was the last time we calculated in 2018, and in Antigonish from $17.85 to $19.55. Both have gone up quite significantly. Some of that is absolutely due to inflationary increases, including to rent in particular, but some of that is because the costs have increased so much. The family income went above some thresholds for government transfers. So our family no longer qualifies for the GST credit, which decreases the income they get from government. Our family also has a clawback in the Canada Child Benefit, and that's true for Antigonish as well. That means that more of the income needs to come from the employer. And one of the things that we flagged here is how important it is that our government transfers and clawback rates are very sensitive to ensure that people are helped out so that they get out and stay out of poverty. I'm going to end Nova Scotia there and going to try and turn this over to stop sharing. Chelsea.
Great, thanks, Christine. I'm just trying to share my screen now. There we go. Can everyone see can you see my slides? We good?
Good.
Okay. Good, thanks, Christine. Okay, so as I'm based in St. John and did the calculation for St. John, New Brunswick, I will be talking for the next few minutes, similarly as Christine did, about the expenses and the living wage in St. John. So as you can see, our living wage for 2020 for St. John, New Brunswick is $19.55. And this is an increase of $1.37 since 2018. Conveniently, in 2018, our living wage was $18.18, and this wage for 2020 of $19.55 is 7.5% higher than our 2018 rate. For what this looks like as far as total household income after all taxes have been deducted and we have added back in all of the transfers that we ensure this family receives in this calculation, it yields an annual household income of nearly $69,000. So I have a pie chart up similar as Christine had for Halifax, and our expenses are slightly different when it comes to childcare and shelters. So for St. John, New Brunswick, childcare is actually the most expensive item. However, the three top items are still childcare, shelter, and food, and take up over half of the household's budget. This was the same distribution that we had in 2018 as well. In 2018, childcare was the most expensive budget item, followed by shelter and food as well. So our childcare costs for our family in St. John are almost $15,000 annually, and again, take up 22% of the family's budget. Shelter costs are almost the same amount as childcare, and again, it includes rent, content insurance, utilities, and internet, and costs the family $14,431 per year. And food, again, our third most expensive budget item, is coming in at $12,603. So I won't leave this up long, as it is also in our report. Just noting here, this is the breakdown of how much how much the expenses cost on a monthly and annual basis. So again, the top three, childcare, shelter, and food, which are similar to the other communities, along with household expenses and transportation. Following those, these three here, the top three, not only are they the top three most expensive items, they're significantly more expensive than the additional items on an individual basis. So where we calculated this in 2018, we also took a look in this report at what has changed since 2018. And the family's total expenses have increased by 4.3%. And as Christine mentioned, some of this is due to inflationary increases. However, some of the expenses have increased significantly. And we actually have two expenses in St. John that are accounting for 2/3 of this total increase in family expenses that I'll touch on just quickly. So the first one is rent, and this isn't just the shelter component, this is specifically talking about rent in St. John. Rent alone has increased by 12.5% since our 2018 calculation. And again, we use the median rent for a 3-bedroom apartment in the South End, which again means that 50% of the rents available, or not necessarily available, but the rents in St. John and the South End are below this number and 50% are above. And rent alone has increased by $100 a month since 2018, from $800 a month to $900 a month. Childcare is also another expense that has increased significantly since our 2018 calculation, and it has increased by $59.20 a month by a total of 5%. And again, rent and childcare are accounting for 2/3 of the total increase in the family's expenses. So Christine touched on these a little bit earlier, but I just would like to drive some of these points home, as it really makes a case of how different provincial tax laws and different legislation can make a difference. The provincial boundaries can make a difference in what wage your community ends up with. So on the tax and transfer side, our St. John family, in comparison to the Halifax family, receives an additional $590 a year. And this is through the New Brunswick Working Income Supplement, as well as the New Brunswick HST credit. Again, the Nova Scotia family doesn't qualify for their HST credit, and they do not have a similar program to the Working Income Supplement. Our provincial tax rates are also slightly lower, which is contributing to a slightly lower wage in St. John in comparison to Halifax. And as Christine mentioned, our family receives an additional $1,100 from the Canada Child Benefit, and this is simply due to having a lower living wage and therefore lower employment income. On the cost side of the equation, the major difference between Halifax and St. John is shelter. Halifax's shelter costs are 31% higher than St. John's, which is a difference of over $5,000 annually. Childcare and transportation costs are also slightly higher in Halifax than in St. John. One thing that we do highlight in this year's report, and Christine will touch on this a little bit more later when she talks recommendations, is we did look at the childcare programs available in both provinces. However, they are not included in our official living wage calculation, as they are subsidy programs, and subsidies do not guarantee access. We know in St. John, for example, there are only enough licensed spaces for 47% of St. John non-school age children. Therefore, where the subsidy, there's no way to guarantee that the family can access the subsidy. If we had a universal childcare program, that would be something that would be factored into the living wage, but where it is not included in the official calculation. However, we do look at what impact this might have, again, not so that we encourage subsidies, but more so to advocate for a universal childcare program. So we added in, for reference, the New Brunswick Designated Center Parent Subsidy, and this lowers the living wage by $1.75 if we assume that the family is able to access this program. With that in mind, although that is a significant drop in the living wage, childcare is still costing the family over $11,000 a year, even with the subsidy, and it is still the third most expensive budget item, which is why we advocate and recommend universal childcare as part of our recommendations to government. We also took a look Christine took a look in Nova Scotia at their new pre-primary, the universal preschool that is rolling out this fall. This program is only available for 4-year-olds. And we looked at how this would impact the living wage if the child if their youngest child was 4 instead of 2, and this would lower the living wage by $2.20 for Halifax. So these are just some examples of how government policies can have an impact on the living wage, and how highlights the desperate need for universal childcare in both provinces and across Canada. So I am going to turn it back over to Christine, and she will introduce our speakers.
Okay, we are going to ask our community representatives to now respond to the report. We have 3 representatives. The first will be Suzanne McNeil. Suzanne is the president of the Halifax Dartmouth District Labor Council. The second is Tom Webb. Tom is the vice chair of the LaHave River Credit Union Board in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. The LaHave River Credit Union is a cooperative financial service provider for people in Lunenburg and Queens counties on Nova Scotia's South Shore. Tom is also an adjunct professor at St. Mary's University and is the founder of the International Cooperative Management Center at St. Mary's. And third, we welcome Mandy Burke-Evans, who is the director at the St. John Learning Exchange in St. John, New Brunswick. Over to you, Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Christine, and a huge thanks to the CCPA and their partners for doing this wonderful report. As Christine said, my name is Suzanne McNeil, and I'm the president of the Halifax, Dartmouth, and District Labor Council. And, local district labor councils represent workers across all sectors of unionized work in our communities. And what labor councils do is really work on the matters that connect workers and workers' movements to the life of our community. And so we're really interested in these living wage calculations because our movement is fundamentally about workers fighting for a dignified life for ourselves, for our families, for each other, and of course at this point in history, because workers need to purchase with their wages so many of the fundamental necessities of life, like shelter, clothing, food, and more. And of course, over the last several decades, the value of our wages, especially for those workers earning on the lower end of the income scale, has eroded considerably. So our ability to comfortably acquire the necessities of life is much more strained these days. And so when we're advocating and fighting for a decent standard of life for everybody, we and other advocates often bump up against these ideas that we sometimes have in the Atlantic provinces, that workers don't need to earn as much here, that the fact that there's a lower standard of living is something that we have to accept. And we really want to push back against this. And so this is why these living wage calculations are so important to us. We need to have a picture and data that is based in facts and evidence of just how much it costs to have this decent living standard. And so, the fact that we have this report with a methodology that is fact-based, that gives us a realistic view that can't be refuted by policymakers, by big business. This is really important to us. And we really want to emphasize, as a workers' movement, that our communities really are better off when we can take care of ourselves and each other. And we saw just how important and necessary it was during this pandemic to put money in workers' pockets to stave off the worst parts of the possible economic disaster that resulted. And we also saw that some of, all workers are important, but I am going to highlight that some of the most critical workers during this time this year, in the food chain to deliver some of the most essential goods to us, those engaged in care work. These are also some of the lowest paid in the workforce. And a lot of these folks in our community get called heroes, and in some cases there was temporary so-called hero pay that was implemented. But by and large, the folks that do essential work are scraping by when it comes to their paychecks, and there needs to be change on this matter. We also note that many employers and employers organizations are pushing back against measures like the CERB, because it gets difficult to recruit workers when the pay and working conditions are abysmal, but when workers have other options. Likewise, even before the pandemic, there has been pushback against movements for income justice, like the Fight for 15. And so, this is something that we support as a labor movement. And we want to be able to demonstrate the substance behind these political demands. And I want to, as I wrap up my remarks, we see many wonderful possibilities of how strong our communities can be when we can live safe and dignified lives, and how the living wage is a crucial piece of this. And when workers don't make a living wage, there's certain things that we see. So in order to try to close the gap between the low wage levels and what it actually takes, we see that workers will be compelled to work longer hours. We see folks that are compelled to have multiple jobs. We see workers, and this especially impacts women. We see folks not enter the workforce if childcare is too expensive. So that has a major impact on women's labor force participation. And we also see a lot of workers who maybe have different circumstances, maybe it's a disability, maybe it's, they need to take care of others themselves. We see a lot of folks not able to fully participate economically and socially, which has a lot of implications for the social fabric of our communities. And so, in conclusion, I would like to say that, securing the conditions for a dignified life for workers and our families and our communities is the guiding principle of the labor movement, and it should also be the same for policymakers and employers.
Thank you, Suzanne. Excellent comments. I liked how you talked about how workers try to bridge that gap between the costs of living and what they are earning. I'm going to turn it over to Tom. There you are. Over to you, Tom.
Very good. Well, let me start off by saying that our credit union is absolutely delighted to be a part of the living wage movement. I want to tip my hat to Dr. David Maxwell, who is the chair of our board for a fair number of years, and who led the drive and did a lot of the research that brought us to adopt a living wage for the credit union. The purpose of a cooperative financial institution is to meet member and community need. And clearly, those needs include being able to provide our staff with an income that allows them to live comfortably and reasonably. And so the living wage is attractive to us from that point of view. As well, there are a set of values and principles that have been adopted by the credit union movement around the world. And while there's no international standard that says every cooperative business shall do this, and exactly that, either in terms of the environment or fairness or equity. One of the principles is equity, and that means being fair. And it seemed clear to us that cooperatives need to be fair to their workers, and that means that The gap between the highest and the lowest paid should not be huge. It means that they should be able to have a reasonable standard of living. And if we look around the cooperative world, there's a huge network of worker-owned cooperatives in the Basque Country and Spain, where the gap between the highest paid and the lowest paid is 6-to-1. And for the whole network, for the network as a whole, that's within any one cooperative. For the network as a whole, it's 9-to-1. And that compares to 300, 200-to-1 in investor-owned businesses. So there is some level of consensus among cooperatives that what we pay our workers is an important part of who we say we are and of achieving our purpose. Fair pay is then became a question of what does that mean for our credit union? What does equity mean? And we looked at the living wage idea and the living wage calculations and what CCPA was doing, and we liked it. We looked at it and asked the obvious question, can we do this? Is this within our financial means? And we're a financially successful credit union, and we concluded yes, we could, and we are delighted to be in the position to be able to do that, and we intend to remain there. So that's all I want to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thanks to the La Have Credit Union for paying its workers a living wage. And just to clarify out here, we would love to have a certification program for employers. We don't have one out here. There are others in Ontario and BC, for example. Something that I'd like to have come here is really recognize those employers who are currently paying a living wage, who are making plans to pay a living wage. We know that there are many communities in those provinces where the certification programs exist, where employers from nonprofits to public employers to small businesses to medium businesses to larger businesses are paying and are certified as living wage employers, and that's a critical part of why we're doing this work. We only hear from employers who reach out to us, and so I thank you to the La Have Credit Union. We've also heard from the Cooperators Insurance, who have increased their workers' pay to the living wage from a few years ago. We've heard from organizations like Add Some for Women and Children, which is a shelter in Halifax, which has been paying its workers a living wage, and some small operations as well. So that is absolutely part of doing this work, and part of, I think, the full package of thinking about community economic development and what our governments can do is to support enterprises like cooperatives and social enterprises, which is our next community representative. Mandy Burke, over to you in St. John.
Thank you, Christine. And I'd also like to thank CCPA and the HDC and Chelsea for all the hard work that's gone into this report. So I'm a social enterprise director within the St. John Learning Exchange here in St. John. And so a little bit about the social enterprises, which is really, well, I guess I should start with the St. John Learning Exchange. So we are a nonprofit organization. Our organization's poverty reduction, and we target poverty reduction through education and skills training. That being said, one of the arms we have are for-profit businesses that are owned by our nonprofit. They are considered social enterprises, which is really unique because we are working with individuals that are transitioning potentially out of poverty or looking for work. A lot of times individuals are coming through programs and they have barriers. And when we talk about barriers to employment, I'd like just to touch base to remove some stigma. So barriers to employment don't necessarily mean that you've been in generational poverty. Barriers to employment can be post-secondary, but you struggle with time management, communication, professionalism, conflict resolution. So we work on that through programs and also through our businesses. Our businesses operate very similar to all other small businesses. I want to make sure it's clear that I am completely in support of a living wage. And I do see on the ground level the impact it has when you're moving somebody from below the poverty line to the poverty line and then transitioning off the poverty line. So a lot of our businesses, we're in the food industry, which is catering and cafe. We also do school food, non-traditional programs. We provide a lot of the lunches. We also have a cleaning company. Again, these are entry-level positions. And we also have a social media management company. So that's Stone Soup, Cafe and Catering, Voila Cleaning Services, and Creative Squirrel. So having the discussion, I've talked a lot about the living wage, and also for us, it's not achievable, which makes me sad. So our goal is to be able to support and train and help individuals remove barriers to transition on to higher wage employment. But the living wage, I need to say, not all employers are created equal and not all employees are created equal. And as they do that transition, a lot, like we're talking like shelter, transportation, childcare, when you're transitioning from the poverty line and you have employers that are trying to support that, what happens is they move to the poverty. They're right on the line. They're not above and they're not below it. And all it takes is one obstacle to happen for them to fall back. So let's talk a bit about COVID and how that's affected even my team. To have somebody that bus transportation, it essentially got cut back. So it got cut back. So now the individual, it has to walk 45 minutes to work to get to the nearest bus stop with no guarantee they can actually get on the bus to get to their job. So then they go from maybe making $15, $16 an hour and trying to pay their shelter, their food, and now they have to look at purchasing a car. And then you look at the expenses that come with the car. So it's really quick to see how just one obstacle when you sit on that line can drop you below. And for some people, they become defeated and don't want to continue that journey. As an employer of social and transitioning and barriers, I would absolutely love to be able to provide my staff all with a living wage. Unfortunately, the industry we're in is super competitive. So one of the things that got brought up earlier was childcare. So it's like childcare workers, I guarantee, are not making $20 an hour. If they were making $20 an hour, the cost of childcare again will go up. So it's like, how do we balance that? How do we get, like, I'm interested to hear what the asks are from the government to bridge the gap, because I do believe there's very few small businesses that are able to achieve this. I love what Tom said in his discussion. He said they all sat down and said, can we do this? And when they said yes, it happened. So it's, how do we encourage more employers to have that, to be asking those questions, and what can we ask from government to help us bridge that gap so we could all give everybody the quality of life that they deserve. Thank you. I'm going to sign off.
Thanks so much, Mandy. Some excellent questions, and I'm not going to spend too much longer speaking, and I do want to turn it over to questions. I do just want to share one more slide with you, which is an important one, and I think Mandy's raising some of the questions that hopefully are answered in our full report. But if you do have a question, please ask it in the chat. And if you are media and would like to ask it live, just indicate that and I will find you and allow you to do that. Otherwise, just put a question in the chat and we'll try to direct it. Before I do that, just one more, so you have a look at what the research tells us. And I think for most people, this is just gut instinct. Of course, if you are paying your employees a living wage, that impacts, one, it increases their wages and their economic well-being. But the reduction in stress, the improved mental and physical health, and for our employers, I mean, what this slide is really showing is just how much it makes a difference. Sorry, I'll do that so you can see it. Now I'm gonna flip it. Just how much the benefits of paying a living wage are win-win-win, employee, employer, as well as community. A lot of the evidence that's summarized in this slide actually comes from firm level data. So there's lots of firms across, lots of businesses across the United Kingdom in particular that have been doing this research, looking at what's happened when they pay a living wage. They see lower turnover, they see a decrease in absenteeism of employees. They see a lower cost savings because their employees actually stay longer with the business, and that means lower costs in hiring and training. And there's an impact from customers who are looking to support businesses that see the value and are able to to pay a living wage. And as a community, of course, I think as Suzanne also outlined, it's important that our workers are able to participate in our communities, but this actually reduces costs on government, whether that's on healthcare, on social services, but it allows for people to actually be purchasing in our economy, which has an impact for those small businesses that need consumers in their door. And that supports all of us to be able to access quality public services. The last thing that I will emphasize here, if I can do that, is our recommendations. Again, you can have a look at our report for the full range of recommendations that we have here, including to increase the minimum wage. The fight for 15 has been a fight that's been going on for a while. That needs to happen. It needs to happen quickly. We've recommended 2 years for the 15, and then some plan to get our minimum wage to a living wage. But what we've said in this report is paying a living wage is absolutely about employers, all employers, but it is also not all on employers. We need to ensure that we address the cost side while we also address the income side. And many of the costs, the highest costs, are better addressed by government and best addressed outside of the market. So what can governments do? Well, we recommend some things. As Chelsea said, we need a funded system of early learning and childcare that's child-centered, that's play-based, that's seamless, affordable, if not free, and accessible to all who need it. We need more affordable housing. We need that to be built in our communities, but we also need legislation to control the amount that rent can be increased annually. We need to invest to support local, sustainable, affordable food production and distribution. We need to expand public health care. Our public health care should include pharma care. It should include dental care. We need more mental health supports. We need governments to step forward and fund more accessible, affordable public transit within communities and between our communities. And we need to invest with a goal to make post-secondary education free. While governments work toward that goal, it is important that they reduce tuition and make it possible for more people to upgrade their skills and education without having to take on a huge debt load. More part-time college options should be available to support workers who want to do some retraining while they remain in the workforce. And finally, the living wage is one tool. These are my concluding remarks. Only one tool to help our low-wage workers. Calling for employers to pay a living wage voluntarily is certainly not a substitute for a substantive increase in the minimum wage. more stronger and proactive enforcement of labor standards, and for public investment in all those quality public services. New Brunswick and Nova Scotia desperately need a wage-led strategy of inclusive growth to ensure employees receive sufficient income to lead a decent quality of life. Governments must go beyond helping those who are working, however, and ensure that everyone, regardless of their work status, is able to live as full participating members of our communities. I'm going to open up to questions, but I'm going to also welcome two of our other community representatives. Wyann Sandler is the Executive Director of the Antigonish Women's Resource Center and Sexual Assault Services Association, and she's also Chair of the Antigonish Poverty Reduction Coalition, which formed in 2010 and brings together organizations, groups, and individual community members committed to eliminating poverty in Antigonish town and county. And I also want to welcome Louise Smith McDonald, who is the co-director of the Every Woman Center in Sydney, Nova Scotia. Now, if you would like to ask any of them a question, you are welcome to do so in the chat, and I'm going to try and get over there now and see what we have. So we will have a recording of this, and yes, I can share the PowerPoint for people. We'll put that on our respective Facebook pages. I don't see any questions unless I'm missing them. Why don't I unmute and we can actually. There you are. Have a chat if anybody would like to join in. If you have any reactions to the other panelists, you're welcome to do so. So one of the, I see a question here, which is, do we mind speaking about how a living wage would complement basic income? I can begin that, but if anybody else wants to jump in, one of the things that we talk about in the report is that what we've calculated here is a living wage, which is obviously for employees who are employed or will be employed, and it is an hourly rate based on working 35 hours a week, and that a basic income is actually a government transfer. So that's one, very different in terms of the source. Could it complement the other? I mean, it could, in that what we show in terms of the living wage calculation is the Canada Child Benefit, which is a government transfer. It impacts the living wage. So if as the Canada Child Benefit increased, we actually saw the living wage in Halifax go down. So when we had calculated it in 2016, we then recalculated it in 2018. And in the intervening years, the Canada Child Benefit was introduced. And that meant that actually the living wage for Halifax did go down. Now you saw the opposite happen this year, where the Canada Child Benefit was clawed back because the family's income went too high, and so they faced the first kind of clawback threshold of the Canada Child Benefit. So the government transfers absolutely do work. Do work hand in hand. And as you can see, even the small transfers that are available, in particular in Nova Scotia, our families don't even get access to. So the Nova Scotia Affordable Living Tax Credit, our families' living wage income is too high. The poverty reduction credit is like for people who are destitute only on social assistance, which you all know is far below any poverty line. And our family no longer even gets access to the GST credit. Our families do not get access to the working income tax benefit, or the Canada Workers Benefit, I think is what it's now called. The families in New Brunswick do get access to a couple more of those kinds of tax transfer credits. So yes, they do go hand in hand. And if they're, even if we did a little bit of tinkering on the side of like making the working income tax better, or the Canada Workers Benefit work better, that would support workers better, which does take some pressure off of our employers as well. So there is a role there to play for sure. And I mean, the other thing that we talked about is the level at which the CERB was pegged. If you do the math on that, and we played with our Excel spreadsheets to see what that came out to, that $2,000 a month comes out to $15 gross. So that tells us that, our wages at, $12.55 is the minimum in Nova Scotia, and is it $11.70 in New Brunswick? Yes, are far below the living wage, and that 15 is definitely a peg that we need to think about as we think about the taxes and transfer system. That's one of the things that we flagged, is there is this thing called the benefit cliff, which I think Mandy was also pointing to. You get a little bit more income, and suddenly you lose access to pharmacare, or you lose access to a subsidy, or maybe you don't get access to a lower income bus pass, which I know is available in Halifax as well. So we do need to ensure that we have universal public services so that doesn't happen, but that even the taxes and transfers that we have are more generous, and that the clawback rates are very slowly clawed back, so we don't hit a cliff and there you are trying to figure out what, do you withdraw from the labor force to pay for childcare, as Suzanne outlined. So thanks for that question. Anybody else want to jump in?
Louise.
Yes,
I just
Louise.
want to say thank you for including Cape Breton in this round. I really appreciate that very much. It's great information that you've provided. I've given it a quick perusal, but I will be looking at it further. Even and working in nonprofit, sometimes it's difficult to pay a living wage. We are committed to doing that. However, sometimes, again, because of funding issues, government look at it and almost question, why are you paying that kind of wage? And we're just in the process of looking at hiring some shelter workers. And so we've looking at the 17 that you provided, the 1765, was suggested by the funder, which was government, that well, that really isn't, you can get that for 15, I'm sure, in this area. So, it's a huge education process, but I really appreciate being included and appreciate what you're doing. It's great work.
Thanks so much, Louise. I see we are coming up to the hour, and I don't think I will keep people. If anybody does have some concluding remarks, I certainly welcome that. Louise makes a good point. One of the things that we would like to see is our governments actually lead on this. So we've seen many municipalities across the country, in particular in BC, but also some in Ontario, that have actually become living wage employers. That means all of their contract employees are paid a living wage, that they no longer have this race to the bottom for contracts. That alone would make a big difference. Our governments actually procure a lot in our economy, billions of dollars. I know it's been on the agenda in Halifax for quite a while. I would like to see that be part of the discussion. Our governments actually have to lead on that, and that includes when they are providing funding to our nonprofits, that actually we ensure that our nonprofits are able to pay a living wage. And then that when we do community economic development support, as Mandy, I think, said, all business enterprises are not built the same. And we know that cooperatives and credit unions and social enterprises have a triple bottom line. And so it would be important for our governments to actually support those kinds of enterprises and not those who are already profitable and making a choice not to pay a living wage. Those would be my final comments. Does anybody else have a comment? Suzanne, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for your concluding remarks, Christine. I also want to point out to folks here in Nova Scotia that we have municipal elections happening. And here in Halifax, we'll be taking a pretty close look at what candidates are for council and mayor are going to be saying on the topic of a living wage ordinance. So this is a pretty critical time, you know, in Halifax and in communities across Nova Scotia to be really pushing and bringing this issue to the forefront.
Okay.
I would like to kind of wrap up. There was part, like I felt like 5 minutes I didn't have enough. I would say that to other businesses and the local economy, I'm very lucky and I have the opportunity to work with amazing people. And as individuals transition and they are bringing in more money, it's amazing to see how they spend it. Like, they're investing in our economy to have the extra cash to just go to Sussex. For some people, that's just to go 2 communities over is a big deal, or to be able to camp in Miramichi, which is a 3-hour drive, is a big deal. So by individuals being able to make a living wage, they actually are reinvesting into our economy, which is fabulous. So it's, for me, to get there would be ideal. I love, again, what Tom said, can we do this? And if we can't, how do we get there? So I really appreciate all the work that's gone into this. And I'm curious to see how the recommendations roll out with government. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks everybody for working on this with us, for being here, for your thoughts, and Chelsea in particular. Thanks for all of your work on this report and all the others who gave us feedback through this process. It's important that we ensure that the work that we do in calculating the living wage resonates in the communities. So I thank you. Okay.
Thanks, Christine.